So good to be with all of you. Happy for the opportunity we have to study together in the book of Acts. And just remember, even though I'm standing behind the podium here or the pulpit, it doesn't mean it's a sermon, so everybody can contribute or ask questions or make comments. So we welcome those. Right. We're in Acts chapter 17, and we were looking really at the response to Paul's sermon is where we left off in verse 32. So we're right at the end of chapter 17. Then we'll be ready to look at chapter 18, Paul's work at Corinth. Before we enter into our class, help us fix our mind on spiritual things and have the Lord's blessings. We'll ask Brother Brody to direct us in a word of prayer. Amen. All right, so Paul has preached the sermon about the unknown God and revealed the true nature of God to the people, and he began to preach to them about Jesus Christ being raised from the dead and is going to be the judge someday, that people are responsible to God, and he got a mixed reaction to the lesson. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We will hear you again concerning this." So there were a lot of the people didn't want to hear any more once he talked about the resurrection. But there were others that wanted to join with Paul and study some more, and there was a church established there. So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed. Among these were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So there was a group that did join with Paul that believed what he taught, and there was a congregation formed there. One of the members of that congregation had been one of the judges, an Areopagite, one of those that sat on the judgment seat there in Athens about these things. And we mentioned last time that a person had to have qualifications to be that kind of judge, had to be over 60 years old, had served in other positions as a magistrate and so on. And some people say that he was one that eventually became one of the elders there in Athens. And Damaris, a prominent woman, we've mentioned about prominent women. Some early Christians said she was the wife of Dionysius. Don't know that for sure, but that was what was handed down among the early Christians about who she was. So they not many mighty in the church, right? But there are some. There are some that are in high positions. You know, most people are from the middle class and lower, but there's a lot of there are some that are among these ruling elites and so on that are in society. So again, we have a local church there. Then after you finish chapter 18, we move on to chapter 17, we move on to chapter 18, and Paul is going to go from Athens further south until he comes to Corinth. And we'll study about the establishment of the church at Corinth and at Cenchrea in 1818. Here's a map of Greece, and the different provinces, I guess it was divided into under the Roman Empire. They had Macedonia in the northern part of Greece. The southern part of Greece was Achaia. And Athens, of course, was a big cultural center, had a lot of ancient history, a place of philosophy. Corinth was actually the capital of Achaia, and it was one of the great trade centers of the world because of its location there, and one of the largest cities. And Paul, of course, if you want to establish the church in places where it can really grow and spread the gospel, he knew the proper hub to go to have that happen in Achaia was the city of Corinth. You have north, south, east, west travel there. You see that tiny isthmus that Corinth sits right below where traffic would go all different directions. Here's the blow-up then of the area where ancient Corinth was located, and where Paul was preaching there in the green. And then notice this Corinth Canal. That's 4 miles across from the Adriatic to the Aegean Sea. and you save 400 miles that you would have to sail around in dangerous waters to go around the Peloponnesus, which is the palm. It's like Greece is sort of like the hand. But if you could just go straight across, it would save you all of that bad weather and everything. And so from ancient times, they wanted to build a canal there. It's only 4 miles across. And it is pretty deep, though. I'll show you pictures. But what they would do instead was drag ships across. They had a thing set up where you could drag a ship from one side to the other, unload it, drag it across, reload it. It saved you that much time and trouble if you could do that than sailing around. So, very strategic location between northern and southern Greece there, and east and west traffic on the sea. So Corinth is a very important place. Then notice Cenchrea down here, that's the seaport on the eastern side, where Paul's going to talk about a church there too. So after these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. So Paul journeys, I don't know if it was by land or sea, but he goes on down from Athens to Corinth, and it's about 50 miles southwest of Athens when you come to Corinth. And it's on that narrow isthmus that divides the Peloponnesus from Attica, the area where Athens is at, and where the Sparta and those other cities are on the Peloponnesus. You ever heard of the Peloponnesian War, where the Spartans are fighting the Athenians and all of that in ancient history? The capital of the Roman province of Achaia, and great commercial city for many years there, and it's still an important city. 2 seaports, one on either side, served the city of Corinth, and it was dangerous, as I said, to sail around. Slaves worked there to drag those ships across the isthmus, and I guess all the sailors got shore leave, and they could all go into Corinth and have a big old time like we know sailors will do sometimes, right? So it was a very immoral, wicked city, too, in the ancient world. Matter of fact, in a play, you have your stock characters that represent different places in plays. If somebody was from Corinth, they were always drunk. So it tells you the character of that city and all kinds of immorality. And the book of 1 Corinthians tells us the church was coming out of all of that. And so you had some of that you had to fight in the church, telling people don't be drunks, right? And don't be immoral. Don't be swindlers. So it was a very wicked place. You might not think there'd be a church established there. But it was one of the big, great churches. People there really needed to be saved from their sins. And there were many people that came to the Lord in that place. It was quite a contrast with the society around them, those that were trying to be holy and righteous. So the population was made up of Romans and Greeks, and Paul came to the city in about 52 A.D. That's where we find from an inscription, that's when Gallio was the proconsul, was 52. And Paul's going to have a trial before him. So it kind of helps us fix the time. He's there for about 2 years, so you get either side of it there, 52. And great place to spread the gospel. Here's what archaeology has shown us where they've dug up the ancient city. And you can see the amphitheater where it's located in the city of Corinth. And up here you have Acrocorinth is a big hill we're going to see in some pictures where they would build the big temples and stuff up on top of Acrocorinth. And it's said that there was a temple there to Aphrodite, that you have the foundation of it there, where there were 1,000 sacred priestesses and prostitutes that would come down into the city at night, is what's been handed down from ancient times. So again, it shows the idolatry and immorality that was there when the gospel came, and what needed to be transformed through the teaching of the gospel. And of course, over time it was, wasn't it? All of that idolatry went away, that form of idolatry anyway, and was replaced with higher thinking than what they had at that time, and superstition. The Bema is where the judgment seat was at, where Gallio is going to try Paul. And the Agora is the marketplace there. You can see the rectangle that's there, which was the marketplace where Paul probably did a lot of preaching in that place. So just some picture of how the city was laid out. Here is the Agora, and one of those places you could walk around there and think, well, Paul and Timothy and Silas, they were walking around there too at one time, same place. So you see the view looking down from that Corinth, that upper hill, looking down where the archaeologists are digging there and showing all of that. Here's some of the temple of the lower city, temple of Apollo that was mentioned there on that map. You can see some of the pillars that are remaining from those temple of Aphrodite that was up there on the Corinth. See the hill in the background there where there were temples up there, and then the lower city in that picture. Here's an inscription about Erasmus, the treasurer. And when you read Romans 16:23, you read about Erasmus, that's a member of the church, who was the treasurer of the city. Now, how much does the archaeology confirm what the New Testament says? There was a man in that city with that name that was the treasurer of the city at that time, and he was a Christian. He obeyed the gospel. And we have an inscription with his name on it. It was found in 1929 by archaeologists there. Here again, standing up there on the top of the Corinth. It rises 1,800 feet above the surrounding plain. That's where that temple of Aphrodite was at. Here is the canal that was dug. When I was reading about this canal, it was telling about all of the Franks that were used. So I guess the French, they dug the Suez Canal. And for centuries, people had wanted to build this canal. Instead of dragging boats across and all of that, we're going to dig this canal. There were a saying that whoever tried to dig this canal, would die early. some philosopher or something. And there were 3 emperors that tried to dig that canal, and all 3 of them died before they could finish the plans to get it done. Caligula, Nero, they all tried to dig a canal across there, and they all died ahead of time. And you can see it was quite an undertaking to move all of that dirt to get across that 4 miles, to make that 4-mile canal. Yes? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, worldliness is a constant threat and something we're all trying to work on. Just to say a few more things about this canal there. As you can see an aerial picture there of the 4 miles that it travels. It was built in the 1880s is when it was finally completed. It took 11 years, I think, for them to dig that, and the company went broke, and then a bank that tried to refinance it went broke. It was just like one financial disaster after another getting that finished. And notice this ship going through there, like a small cargo ship or cruise ship that would go through there. You see the problem with how wide it is? They didn't make it wide enough. So the big ships can't go through there. And they found out there's a problem, all kinds of problems between the Adriatic Sea and the Aegean Sea. The tides are different at different times of the day, right, as the tide moves around. And so it would be high, the ocean would actually be a little higher on one side than the other, so you get this big current flowing through there during the day, going one way or the other. So that caused all kinds of problems with people bouncing off the sides of this. They were hoping it would have like 4 million tons of cargo would pass through there, and it ended up like 1 ton or 1 million tons or whatever. And it's used today, but it's still never been the big deal they thought it would be. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to do something like that, maybe you might want to make it another lane wider. That would have helped. I think about a lot of the roads, they have to go back and rebuild our roads and highways all the time. Just make one more lane wider when you did it the first time, it would have sure helped. But anyway, there's quite a story to the whole thing. And some of the best laid plans don't always work out like people think they're going to work out. Even though they've been thinking about it for 2,000 years, all the good it would do. Didn't do as much good as they thought. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. he came to them. So Paul gets to town and he finds some Christians that are already there. Aquila and Priscilla. They had been kicked out of Rome with the other Jews that were there. And it seems from what we know from history that there was a big dispute that happened among the Jews about a certain Crispus. I was talking about Christ. They were fighting over the gospel, and this turmoil broke out, and Claudius Caesar just kicked all the Jews out of Rome. And some of them came to Corinth. And so now they're in that place. So we don't know when Aquila and Priscilla were first converted or who converted them, but they were faithful Christians, and every time they're mentioned in the Scriptures, they always have a church meeting in their home. So they're wealthy people that can, they supply the place for the church to meet, and always had people meeting with them. We're going to see when Paul leaves Corinth, Aquila and Priscilla go with him to Ephesus and help start the church in Ephesus, and the church meets in their home there. So important fellow workers of the Apostle Paul that he meets up with here in the city of Corinth. You notice so many times it'll say Priscilla and Aquila. Now, it doesn't do that here. It mentions Aquila first, but most of the time it mentions Priscilla first. And usually when the Greeks would write, the person that's the more prominent would be mentioned first. Like we were talking about Barnabas and Saul, and then it changed and it became Paul and Barnabas because Paul became the more prominent of the two. And same thing here. So what was it about Priscilla? Well, Priscilla comes from the word Prisca. And that was a certain group of, one of the tribes or the clans, I guess, of the Romans that went back to ancient times. They were part of the ruling families of the city of Rome and the nation of Rome. So she is from a high, one of those prominent women that we read about, from a prominent family, part of the elite people there in Rome. And that may be part of why her name is mentioned first so often. So they are divided into what's called genes or clans, and she comes from the Prisci clan. And again, it shows something about how the Jewish people and had married into, different families also. Here he's married into a wife from a very prominent family there. And the Jewish religion had a big effect among the Greeks and Romans before the time of Christ, and it shows some influence there that we can understand. In all these synagogues, there's the Jews and there's the God-fearing Greeks in all of the synagogues we've been in. So the Jewish religion, the Old Testament law of God, had a big influence across this classical world back then. And again, Chrysostom said I think he lived in the 300s A.D., said her name comes first because she was the stronger of the two personalities. Another idea is that she was converted first, or she had higher social position. There's several different reasons she might have been first. Don't we have that among different couples we know, that even though, maybe the husband's very quiet and he never says much, and the wife is very enthusiastic and knowledgeable, and she's kind of the leading personality in the group, that you might mention her first when you were talking about that couple. I've met a lot of couples like that. And that could be the case there too. Claudius was the emperor from 41 to 45 A.D. And he expelled the Jews when they were fighting over the Messiah in 49. So maybe they've been there for a couple of years before Paul gets there, 3 years. Any other thoughts on this chart? Anything anybody wants to add? And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working. For by trade, they were tent makers. So we learned something about Paul, right? And we know he worked to support himself so that these new converts didn't have to support him. And what was Paul doing to support himself when he went from place to place? He was a tent maker. So he worked with this fabric, which would include making sails for ships, any kind of canvas type of things that would be involved in tent making. And certainly Corinth was a big location for that. And also Tarsus. We know from archaeology there were 7 different big places that made tents and things in Tarsus, where Paul was from and where he was brought up. So all these Jewish families, the fathers would teach their sons a trade, so they'd always have some manual labor they could fall back on if they lost their position or needed to work. And Paul was a tent maker, and certainly sets a pretty good example for all of us to have our children equipped to where they can make a living and have some kind of way that they can take care of themselves, see that they have some kind of skills. And so Paul works with them. So they had a close relationship not only in Christ but also in their work. And they were able to do that, I guess, when they got to Ephesus as well. Continue that work. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Paul's got a pattern, doesn't he, that we see. Everywhere he goes, if there's a synagogue there, he starts there. And he would take advantage of that opportunity where they would invite visiting rabbis and teachers to address the group. And he started working, showing them the Old Testament, Jesus, and then show that Jesus is the Christ, right? After he had laid the foundation about what the Christ was supposed to do, he would come and he would be this humble servant, and he would die for other people's sins, and then he would arise to the highest position at the right hand of God, and then he could finally drop the bomb and tell them that Jesus of Nazareth has come and he is that person. Right? So he was reasoning. It means to discuss, to dispute, to argue, to try to persuade. And that's what he was doing with the Jews, get them to believe the gospel and what the prophets foretold. And he was doing this constantly, trying to persuade them. It's in the imperfect tense, something continually done in the past. He was just regularly, day in and day out, trying to persuade people. And notice again, there's not just Jews in the synagogue, but Greeks, proselytes, that also had adopted the teaching about the true God. And Jesus, are Paul's feelings at this time. Why don't we read 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 3. Somebody, Dallas, can you read that? I see you flipping pages there. Okay. So he's at Corinth. He just got there. Go ahead and start in verse 1. Read down a little ways. Okay, that's... so you see he's talking about the same thing? When I first came to Corinth, and he tells what he was doing when he first came to Corinth and how he presented the gospel to them. He didn't base it on human philosophy and his own personal wisdom. He just gave them the facts, ma'am. And he backed it up with power. I guess he did miracles also that were backing up his message. So it wasn't human wisdom. It was on the simple gospel story and facts and what the Bible says. And it wasn't about him and his wisdom, but he was just there as a messenger. But do you think Paul had any good reason to be there in fear and trembling? What had he been through the last few? Ran out of Thessalonica, ran out of Berea, right? He's been beaten when he was at Philippi and thrown in jail. And you think that might wear you down a little? I think it would. I think you'd be there in fear and trembling. And we're going to see the Lord is going to appear to him and say, Paul, don't be afraid. Right? And you figure he needed that if the Lord appeared to him in a vision. He doesn't do that all the time. That he was a human being just like us. Right. He had a lot of reasons. He had many reasons for fear and trembling. Both his responsibility and certainly fear and trembling is used about how all of us should deal with our duties before God. So that's certainly a proper idea too. But based upon the vision that he gets, it seems like this other thought was also there in his mind that I might not want to stick around here. You know, if you've had people that have attacked you for trying to teach the truth, I could say from experience, it makes you a little paranoid sometimes that you're thinking, oh no, it's happening again. You know, I preached on this is immoral or whatever, and now there's something stirring up, to move you down the road because of that or whatever. So Paul may have been thinking, this isn't going to last long here. There's some angry faces in the synagogue already, that are starting to act up. Yes, right. And like I say, the Lord knows what we're all capable of bearing, right? And he knew Paul needed a little extra help, at this time in his life. And he does give him that extra, Paul, no one's going to harm you here. He does get arrested, but he has a trial we're going to read about, but he doesn't end up getting hurt. It's the persecutors get hurt instead. So the Lord kind of turns the table on him in Corinth, right? And things turn out, where Paul's thinking, well, this pattern's repeating itself. This is where I get arrested, I get beaten, I have to get snuck out of town with, by the skin of my teeth or whatever. But this place is going to be different, yeah. Right. And early, he was actually foretold by the Lord on the road to Damascus. He said, I'm going to show you how much you must suffer for my name's sake. You've made other people suffer, and you're going to suffer too now, And so he has, but everybody has a breaking point, I guess. And he says, Paul, don't worry, this place is going to be good. Yes, brother. Yeah, be imitators of Paul, right? That's what we're told. He fought the good fight. He finished the course. He kept the faith. Follow him, yes. So in verse 5 it says, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So before Silas and Timothy got there, he was laying the foundation in the prophets, right? He hadn't dropped the bomb yet. And he was working as a tent maker, and he's preaching. But when they come down, what do you think they might have brought with them from Macedonia? Some church aid, right? Paul says, I took wages from other churches to serve you. So they not only brought moral support when they got there, but they also brought financial support for Paul. So now he's not going to have to make tents. He can just work all the time at preaching. And then he starts telling everybody, Jesus is the Christ. Now, when they come down is when he writes 1 Thessalonians. So I have a note there, as we want to harmonize as we go along from here on, the background of the different letters of the New Testament along with the book of Acts. So right about this time is when he writes 1 Thessalonians. He'd been so worried about the church up there that he had to leave prematurely. And he had left Silas and Timothy to work with those churches and try to strengthen them. And he was worried they were being persecuted and they might all fall away. And he thought they might be resentful that Paul had to leave. And Timothy brings him good news. It gives him great joy that they were being faithful and they loved Paul and they understood why he had to leave. And so he writes a letter back up there. He sends them back up there, Timothy, with a letter. And that's 1 Thessalonians. And we'll look at some more of that background, Lord willing, next time. Appreciate your comments. Thank you.